Hi everyone, my name is Sam Stollenwerck, and this past semester I completed my HOD capstone internship at the Native American Indian Association of Tennessee, or the NAIA for short. This is my learning goal evidence, which explores the grant application process for nonprofits and looks in depth at how other people can go about navigating this process and moving forward in their careers. This hopefully will be able to help people to navigate this process and understand how they can hit the ground running a little bit more easily using what I've learned throughout the semester. So before we dive into this grant application process, I think it's important to understand what grants are in order to be able to fully kind of recognize the nuances between grants and then making revenue within a nonprofit organization and understanding why grants are so important to the functions of nonprofit organizations. And then we'll go through and highlight kind of the agenda for this screencast and understanding the process. So first, a grant is simply a financial award that's given to an organization to fund its mission or project or goals. So this past semester, I was working on funding for the Native American Indian Association's Circle of Life Center, which will provide a central gathering point for Native Americans in the state of Tennessee and will also house the headquarters of the NAIA in order to ensure that we can take advantage of organizational synergies and promote our organization in a professional manner. Just from a 30,000-foot view, grants can be awarded from either government entities or the private sector, and we'll talk more about how what we call within the NAIA as funnels and levels, funnels being the private or public sector, and then levels being local, state, or international levels of funding. And so while one important nuance to this is that while most grants take on the form of money, grants can also include services such as people volunteering professional hours, such as like legal services, pro bono work, or even products or in-kind donations such as furniture or technology or things of that nature. So a little bit about what we're going to go through. We're going to talk about how you can go about finding available grants and then determining whether or not you're eligible for such grants. And then once you've determined whether or not you are eligible, gathering application materials for you to apply for the grant and then tailoring your verbiage to these grants. It's important that we make sure we are really appealing to our audience that will be reading this. And then finally, submitting your grant and following up, making sure that you are communicating with the application or the organization to which you submitted your application, and then of course the waiting game and how you can remain optimistic throughout that process. Lastly, before we begin, I want to discuss why this is relevant to the NAIA and how my learning goal really contributed to my organization throughout the semester. Given that I was the grant coordinator during my time with the NAIA, it was important that I become skillful in navigating this process in order to ensure that I could take advantage of my time while I was there. When I was going through the onboarding process, I really had to embrace ambiguity because I wasn't quite sure how I was going to be able to fit into the organization and what they were going to want from me. And so when I explored the mission statement and I really got to know people within the organization better, I came to understand that what we do and what we're trying to achieve and the things that we're trying to go by is to help people. We want to ensure that we are working to give assistance to as many Native Americans within the state of Tennessee as we possibly can. So, for example, in 2018, we assisted 68 families by providing emergency assistance, educational assistance, and then, of course, job placement and career counseling, all of which, or the majority of which, I should say, was funded by grants, both from the federal and private sector. So making sure that I was able to, at the end of my internship, navigate this process and understand how I could apply for these grants in order to bring value to the NAIA in the form of monetary and fiscal solvency was an important goal for me to have during my time with the organization. Just for reference, I think it's important to go through and look at what the NAIA's budget has been for the past 2 to 3 years and see where our money is coming from. Over the past 3 years, we've received between $20,000 and $30,000 in foundation and corporation contributions. This has typically made up a pretty sizable portion of our private sector grants, while government contributions obviously make up between 80 to 90% of our budget year over year. So looking at that more closely, the federal grants which we receive for our career and job placement services are dependent upon the number of Native Americans living in the state of Tennessee. We receive approximately $10 per head is the way it kind of comes to be calculated out. So with approximately 25,000 Native Americans living in the state of Tennessee, that's how you get to that number. And then, of course, you see state and local grants, which are in the form of tax exemptions on our property taxes and other things like in that nature. Individual contributions in the past have not made up a great portion of our budget. However, someone passed away during 2018 and left a sizable donation to the NAIA. And then, of course, earned revenue comes from donations that we receive just from individuals passing by the organization, or when we go out and knock on doors and ask for people to donate to the NAIA. All right, so the first step in moving through the grant application process is, of course, going to be finding available grants. This process and kind of understanding everything that it involved definitely necessitated having a good attitude and learning from failure. Oftentimes I would be searching a great deal on the internet and reaching out to organizations in the area to ask if they knew of grants. Of course, using resources within the NAIA were important, but I wanted to go through this process kind of step by step and break it down so that it's more easy for someone else who really doesn't have the same resources that I had to understand how to go about it. Where to begin? This is what I referenced earlier, talking about funnels. Within the NAIA, we talk about funnels being either private or public. As you saw in the budget, between $20,000 to $30,000 comes from the private sector every year, whereas the public sector contributes a large, significant portion of our budget, with it being close to $250,000. And so beyond these funnels, the next element to consider is the level to which you're seeking funding from. So this is something that we talk about a great deal within the NAIA. Are we seeking it from a local organization or perhaps from an international organization? Because it is definitely a different process dependent upon where you're seeking it from. We're going to use the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community, which is the state under the state and national level, as our example later on in the screencast. But for example, to kind of discuss some of the other ones, the Tennessee Arts Commission typically provides $2,000 to $3,000 in funding for the Native American Indian powwow, which the NAIA puts on every year. The Frist Foundation donated all the computers to the NAIA 2 to 3 years ago, and the Community Foundation, which we'll discuss later on in the screencast, is a huge resource for small organizations within Tennessee because they provide a great deal of networking and resources for nonprofits to reach out to and seek funding from. And then kind of on the opposite end of that, on the international level, Nissan has been an enormous contributor to the NAIA and has given hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past decade to the NAIA to support our mission and our goals. The UBS has also been a contributor as well. However, they have not contributed to the extent that Nissan has. When beginning your search to find private sector grants, I think it's first important to consider your level. Are you looking on the local, perhaps on the state or national, or even in the international realm? And Google will be your best friend during this time. A lot of times, if you just search for perhaps local foundations within Nashville, you'll see that there are tons of different family foundations and other nonprofits that are granting organizations that will provide financial support to organizations dependent upon their mission. And so when I was starting out the process, I just started by Googling, foundations within Tennessee or nonprofit granting organizations within Tennessee. And I found the Grantsmanship Center, which is an extremely helpful resource and helps identify the largest foundations within Tennessee. And as I mentioned before, the Community Foundation of Greater Memphis and the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, which are separate organizations, operate sort of as a resource and networking hub through which much money within the state of Tennessee for nonprofits is distributed. And so they have been a very helpful resource for the NAIA in terms of finding grants to which we can apply to. Another thing to consider is when you are working with nonprofits, ask for other resources and connections, because a lot of times people within the community work together on certain issues and matters that are important to them. And then, like I said, finding large centralized distributors such as the Community Foundation, which we'll discuss next, can be really helpful in terms of focusing your energy and taking advantage of your time in a beneficial manner. Here is just a quick look at the Community Foundation's website. If you can look down in the bottom left-hand corner, they use the line connecting generosity with need. And so a lot of what they do is not necessarily fundraising, but serving as an intermediary between small organizations and potentially much larger donors such as Coca-Cola or Nissan or Wells Fargo, which operate within the state of Tennessee. And so again, making sure that you find those large centralized distributors, whether this is in the state of Tennessee or in other states, can be a very helpful resource for your nonprofit. Shifting gears a little bit to look more closely at public sector grants, grants.gov is a government resource which provides information about government grants. And so if you look in the left-hand side of this screenshot, the keywords that you can use are really helpful in finding and identifying grants that are out there and available. So for example, a quick search of Native American returns 634 matching results, and that's just using that line of verbiage. So using this resource has been really helpful for me and has also returned a great deal of money to the Native American Indian Association. And again, considering your level, perhaps you might not be eligible for a grant for Native Americans within Texas, but it might be within the South or within the southern region. So staying mindful of certain words like that can help you save a lot of time in this process. And then, of course, using other government resources is going to be beneficial as well, which we'll talk about more next. So in addition to grants.gov, another website that I used a great deal was the Tennessee General Assembly website. Finding your legislator within your specific area, whether you're in Maine or in California, can be very helpful, because oftentimes these politicians are very well connected within your community and will have a great deal of resources for your organization. This past few months that I've been serving at the NAIA, I've been able to be a part of a really unique experience, which is that the Circle of Life Native American Center received $250,000 in funding from the state of Tennessee to finalize this project. And so this has been a decade in the works that the NAIA has been working towards. And so getting to be a part of that process has been really rewarding. But of course, as I've gone through this, process and understanding how to navigate everything, learning from failure again remained a central mindset that I had to embrace, because so often, you'll call people and ask, do you have resources? And they'll say, we don't, provide things like that. And so kind of honing in on the types of people you can reach out to and the individuals that'll be helpful is always going to be, a process and a learning learning experience for everyone. The second step within the grant application process is going to be determining whether or not you're eligible to actually apply for the grant. A lot of times you'll go through and you'll find a grant that looks great, only to find out that they won't support the specific project or goal that you're trying to receive funding for. So during this time, I really had to embrace ambiguity, because a lot of the nonprofit sector uses very specific jargon and language that I wasn't entirely familiar with, and would often impose specific kind of arbitrary rules that I didn't really understand. And so making sure that I was staying optimistic and just leaning into the process while asking for feedback from other people who were familiar with it helped me feel confident as I was kind of navigating this process overall. So as we look towards determining eligibility, just try to stay optimistic and remind yourself that you're not going to understand everything at first. For our purposes, we are going to use a grant which I submitted to the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community, which is a tribe from Minnesota. And we're going to look kind of closely at how they actually go about determining whether or not you are eligible to apply for their grants. So looking kind of closely at this screenshot on the page, grants that will not be considered cannot be, for example, for adult sports teams or rodeo sponsorships or any kind of startup costs. Things of that nature won't be considered. I cannot stress enough the importance of looking closely at these at this verbiage to make sure that you don't end up spinning your wheels and wasting time, because a lot of times you can be disqualified in one sentence with one fell swoop if the granting organization does not support a specific goal that you're seeking financial assistance for. And then, of course, the second part to this is following the guidelines. So if they say, as they do on the second bullet point, to keep requests to a maximum of 5 pages, then that is the cutoff and that is the limit. So making sure that you're using your words to be most powerful and convincing is an important kind of component to determining whether or not you're eligible and can actually move forward and submit within a manner that confines to these guidelines. Just for reference, in terms of determining whether or not you are eligible for a grant, the Dan and Margaret Maddox Foundation is a foundation within Nashville, and I spent a great deal of time trying to craft a grant which would fit within the efforts that they support, which you can see are education, low-income youth, and wildlife conservation. And so as I was going through the process, I was trying to figure out how I could tailor my grant, which I was actually applying to have it applied to the Circle of Life Native American Indian Center by saying that it will house a museum and will house a library. But ultimately, after I contacted the organization, they said that no, because this doesn't support a direct educational program such as after-school tutoring, we will not support your application. So that ended up saving me some time on the back end when I reached out directly, and I would highly recommend doing that if you have to go through and apply and create an entirely separate grant for an organization. Once you have determined that you are eligible to apply for a grant, the third step in navigating the grant application process is gathering the appropriate application materials. So this includes all sorts of forms and documents, and can often necessitate rewriting or tailoring letters to fit the organization that you're applying to. An example of some of the application materials that are commonly requested are copies of the NAIA's IRS letter verifying that we are in fact a nonprofit and have the 501c3 status. Within the state of Tennessee, people frequently request a link to your Giving Matters profile. And so in order to create a Giving Matters profile for your nonprofit organization, you just go online, create a profile, and then you go through and provide a summary of what your organization does, what your mission statement is, the programs that you put on, governance, how you actually are governed, so the people that sit on your board, and then who manages the organization day to day, the employees within the office, and then of course financial information such as where your revenues are coming from, what is your yearly budget, what expenses do you have for certain programs, things of that nature. And then of course, one of the third points that we are commonly asked about is having an updated list of our board of directors. One of the recent qualifications is including the diversity of the board on your list to other granting organizations. So stating whether or not you are of a certain race, what your sex is, sexual orientation, gender identity, things of that nature is often requested to ensure that organizations understand who they're giving to and what the leadership looks like. Using the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community's online portal as an example, a lot of times it might be a simple go through and fill things out, such as your organization name, your federal ID, what kind of request you're asking for, the amount requested, things like that, and the population served. And then if you can see down at the bottom where it says upload document, that will be where you include your specific letter, which outlines your goals and what you're trying to achieve, which we'll discuss next. So in the process of creating these letters that you'll send out to organizations to ask for grants, you're going to need to make sure that you're tailoring your verbiage to fit the organization to which you're applying to. This necessitates using two mindsets very closely, both empathy and iteration. So empathy is super important throughout this because you want to make sure that you're appealing to these organizations in a very personal way. Oftentimes these are highly sensitive issues, such as people who don't have enough money to afford food or can't pay their medical bills. So appealing to people through the process of putting yourself or asking them to put themselves in the shoes of the people you help can also help you communicate your story much more easily. And then of course, after you've written up your letter, providing or receiving feedback from people who have gone through the process. So I worked very closely with our office manager, or our former office manager, Elise, because she had sent out so many grants, and she was able to provide a lot of feedback for me through the process and saying, you might want to change this language here, or you might want to tailor it in this way, because she might know, for example, that organization only supports certain types of educational programs under certain circumstances. So making sure that you use the iterative process to your advantage. Here you can see a copy of the letter which I sent to the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. Again, remaining mindful that you're appealing to nonprofits and other philanthropical agencies. This isn't a business letter. These people want to help. They want to provide assistance. But sometimes it's just not within their wheelhouse of the organizations and the type of goals that granting organization helps. So making sure that you know that you're eligible will actually help you in the long run in tailoring your verbiage and making that process easier. As I mentioned, empathy is key telling your story, who you are as an organization and what you're trying to do, including small narratives about the people you help can be a key element in your success. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the iterative process is essential, because making sure that you have communicated your letter in a way that is succinct and clear is going to be important, because oftentimes granting organizations will receive hundreds of applications for grants. And if you're able to communicate in a clear and succinct way what your mission is and what you're trying to achieve, you'll likely have a better result. The fifth and final step to navigating the grant application process is submitting your grant and following up. Making sure that you are staying in contact with the granting organization will be really helpful throughout the process to ensure that you're meeting all of their required deadlines, and that you're going through and making sure that you provide them with all the information that they need. During the final steps of the process, you want to make sure that you confirm that your application has been received by the granting organization. Sometimes I would submit and things would be, there would be issues with technical errors, which actually happened with the Shakopee Mid-Watkinson Sioux community, which was the example that I had used for this screencast. I had reached out to them via email and had called, and I had not received confirmation, and I wanted to make sure it was in by the deadline. And finally, I found out that I was using Safari and not Google Chrome, and that their online portal would only receive applications through that form of search engine. So making sure that you are following up is going to be really important, and then using the time between the deadline and the following and preceding weeks, following up with them every 3 to 4 weeks helps to demonstrate that your organization really is interested in receiving this grant and does need it, and that it will benefit your organization immensely if you're able to receive it. The last component to remain aware of is to retain optimism throughout the process. A lot of times it can be really stressful to meet the deadlines that are imposed, because certain ones will come very quickly, and then other times you'll have ones that are weeks apart. So making sure that you are understanding that this is a difficult process, it can be hard to navigate, but if you really just lean in and make sure that you understand what you're trying to achieve and that you believe in the mission of your organization, can really help you to stay positive throughout the process. The last thing that I want to mention is why this learning goal was relevant to me. My desire to work in the public sector helped me decide that the NAIA was going to be the best internship for me. And so in order for me to kind of move forward and really feel like I was contributing to my organization and would be able to have some key takeaways that I could bring to other organizations in the future, I felt like understanding the nonprofit industry and how the financial engines within the industry work felt like this would be the best goal. In terms of its permanency, from my understanding, speaking to Ray, the executive director of the NAIA, grant applications used to be filed through paper and mail. Now, of course, they've transitioned to an online process, but overall, things really haven't changed. So I feel like this is a goal that I can continue to use, or a skill that I can continue to use down the road. And then, of course, the value that I was able to bring to the NAIA by mastering this process and really learning it from the inside out. So thank you to everyone for listening to this screencast. I hope it was informational, and of course, the process will be difficult. It was for me, and it required learning from failure and retaining optimism. But overall, if you just embrace the mission of your organization, I can assure you that you will be able to achieve the goals that you're trying to accomplish.